We've heard the term validation, and that so-and-so wants validation on a certain idea. Some might even say you should be able to totally get to the point of self-validating completely, or that you should determine the best sources, arguably, to get validation from, and the safest sources too, you might say. Yet I have some questions about validating and some ideas. I think validating can serve to try and validate truths, virtues, morals that are good and accurate. In a world more and more when so much information is to the contrary, and we're left scratching our heads, wondering what is up and what is down. We may thus want validation to tell us that virtue is good and not an impediment, or even something we might call shooting yourself in the foot. In the long run, that is. Hence, seeking validation when being good and upright, you might say, is to your advantage when many say you are a chump, or you're a masochist, or you're a fool. Of course, I think the downside could be to seek validation of a mistruth, of a denial, of burying your head in the sand over some matter. Some would call it a, quote, delusion, a lie we tell ourselves to comfort ourselves, a wish that is not in alignment with reality. We might also want to focus then on truths that are of the nature of an asset we have. We may have a certain trait that is advantageous to others and yet rarely hear it spoken, and be so confused then about this matter. Why is it so rarely told to us we have this wonderful trait, positive trait? If we really had it, wouldn't we hear about it more, you say? And so we want validation that we're not cuckoo about having this trait. Indeed, if we have a very strong asset, we might want validation that we're not just imagining it, that we're not just engaging in, quote, wishful thinking about this trait we have, this asset, that we're not, quote, a narcissist or, quote, bipolar or, quote, manic concerning that asset. We want validation from outside that what we think is a powerful asset really is. Especially when there are elements of envy out there from some saying that asset isn't there, or that it's a weakness. But here is where I think all of us want validation on the same thing. And it is not something very much spoken of, but intuitively felt to the core. I think we want to feel that we have done the best we can concerning our flaws, as we would call them today when compared to other people. We want to believe we are, quote, not criminals in terms of culpability for our flaws. We want someone to understand how we came to be and why certain flaws can't easily be corrected. In other words, we don't want to be blamed for what is just part and parcel of who we are, how we came to be, and how we can't easily change all too often. I think the phrase would be, we want to be validated that our intuition is correct, that we are okay. Interestingly, thus, there's a book by a psychoanalyst back in the 60s or so, Berne, B-E-R-N-E, I'm okay, you're okay. I haven't read the whole book by far, but the word okay to me means you are what you are. You couldn't help who you are, and you probably can't help changing much from that in many a way. So you are okay as you are because you are as you are, without culpability, without blameworthiness. You can't pull a rabbit out of a hat, You can't wave a magic wand and invent the universe out of thin air. You can't be a magician in life. You basically can't be other than what you are. Subject to change from resources and constraints alternatively changing too. In other words, we all want to hear that we are, warts and all, exactly as you expect us to be. You don't expect, for instance, a rock that is fool's gold to be gold. And you don't expect a rock to be a wonderful person you are married to either. A rock is simply what it is, a rock, and a tree, a tree. The hard part comes when someone says, no, rock, you should be something far more. Or, you're blameworthy, rock, because you chose to be a rock and you're not getting off the dime and being more than a rock in the future. This then coming at us from various circles concerning what some say are our flaws. We want to believe we are as we are, just out of a chain of circumstances, and thus not, quote, blameworthy, especially on the hate end of things. Not a very comfortable feeling. Now, I believe many a mother is able to be understanding of someone's flaws, whether it's a young child with colic, or not able to be their pal, or an older child, or of any age, say if they end up in prison for some period of time. Many a mother has an understanding. In other words, their child is as expected, hence the phrase, okay. Sometimes we may want to say phrases like positive unconditional regard or acceptance, but in my mind perhaps the best term is simply understanding of what is. That could even be considered furthermore then as understanding that there is no such thing as a flaw or handicap, that simply things are as they are. For is a tree flawed if it is not polished furniture in front of us? No, a tree is simply a tree, and furniture is furniture. Trees in form that is altered to our benefit. The tree thus is not imperfect or flawed or handicapped because it isn't fine furniture. Hence you would say the tree is okay. The tree is as you would expect it to be by a chain of events or a chain of compounds even. And this, I believe, is what we want most in life almost. Yes, we want physiological needs met, but many, in fact, I believe, sacrifice physiological needs, willing to go to war, fight in a duel, or other matters like this, even go to prison, if they can get back what they don't presently have. And what they don't have all too often is an understanding that they are as expected. You might say, as expected off the assembly line. The assembly line being a chain of events or component parts, if you will, that made that object or us who we are. We want to believe thus we are okay. We are what we are. And we're not what we're not because of certain reasons that are quite explainable if understandable. I would even go to say that's why Mr. Nixon, former president, once said after Watergate, I am not a crook. I believe he was not a crook in the sense that everything he ever was, you might say, did in life thus also, was a chain of events that he had no control over, and thus how can we say that he was anything but, at the end of Watergate, a product off an assembly line of events? And thus, why would you call any object or person at a certain point on an assembly line of life, if you will, a criminal? I think that's what he was getting at. Not necessarily whether he did anything that was painfully impactful upon anyone else. So of all the forms of validation, thus, to recap, that we desire, to have our virtues praised, a form of validation, to have misconceptions, denials reinforced, validation. But the biggest validation of all, to be aware more and more through outside input that we are as we are exactly as expected. There's no such thing as a flaw. There's no such thing ultimately as a handicap. All as is expected. All thus is perfect. And thus all okay. Burns saying, you're okay, I'm okay. You could say the tree is okay. The rock is okay. Everything is as according to plan. You could say a plan not necessarily conjured up, but simply a plan in terms of the idea of what do you expect otherwise, given the inputs. That is my idea, thus, on validating. With one last comment. Perhaps we not only want validation, but need it, because our vocabulary set, I believe, mankind's vocabulary works against us in understanding this reality that we are as we are, not by choice, but by how things turn out once you put in all the inputs. Kind of like baking a cake. A cake can't choose to be other than a cake it turns out to be if you put in certain specific ingredients. But if our words for those ingredients or the cake itself says that we could choose what went into the cake, or the cake could choose what went into the cake, then that's where the problem begins, I believe. Our intuition says we are as we are. Our words mitigate against us, saying, no, you can be more than you are. And that's where the problem lies, I think, more than anything. We want validation of who we are, warts and all, some would say. Because our words, the more we use them, entrap us to figure out who we are in our essence, and who we cannot be simply by wishful thinking. I think that's why Solomon in the Bible, then, the Christian scriptures said, there's much making of words, perhaps said, and too many books. The more books, the more words, the more we get away from understanding how we became who we are and what we can't change about ourselves. Thoughts then.